Hey, folks, welcome back to another episode of the Change Physician Podcast. As your host, Dr. Kevin Cuccaro, with my Amazeballs co-host, Dr. Melissa Cady, and today's guest, Dr. Bill Lear. Dr. Bill Lear is a Mohs surgeon who practices in the state of Oregon, with a fascinating story that we'll be delving into because he actually started his medical career in Canada. So, Bill, great to have you on the show.
Great to be here. Thank you, guys.
And I do have to do one disclosure. You know, they always do those financial disclosures, and Bill is actually my next door neighbor. So this was a pretty easy one to do. But that doesn't bias us in any way, shape, or form, because it is still an amazing story. All right. We like to always start here on why you actually went into medicine, and specifically for you, because you've had sort of a complicated, I'm not going to say torturous career path, but it definitely have some turns and twists in here. So why did you go into medicine? What were your kind of first initial reasons to do this?
Yeah, well, I was a real science nerd, like in junior high and high school. I taught coding to kids, and actually when I was in my last 2 years of high school, I somehow weaseled my way into a molecular biology position and was doing molecular biology of the renin-angiotensin system. And I just love that stuff. I love science. But when I was 16, my younger sister was born, and she had a coarctation of the aorta. And I remember my parents bringing her home, and she wouldn't feed, and her lips started turning blue, and so she needed cardiac surgery when she was 7 to 10 days old. And it was a success. And it was really impactful on me to see the impact that science and somebody's hands could have on life. And so for me, that was really it. It was like a combination of really a real love of science, and having an impact with science. So that would have been the reason. And so when I was like a senior in high school, doing all this molecular biology, which was at the Heart Institute, so I'm from Newfoundland, which is probably another podcast story. But then I finished high school in Ottawa, and worked at the Heart Institute, and then went to University of Ottawa, knowing the very first day of University of Ottawa, I knew I was there to go to medical school.
And just for the non-Canadians who don't kind of know, that's a big distance between the two.
It is. Yeah. Newfoundland is a rock in the middle of the North Atlantic. They call it the Rock. For Canadians who listen to this, they'll probably have Newfie jokes that they associate with Newfoundlanders. We're called Newfies. And it can be a harsh place to live. Like in the winter, you get storms. But in retrospect, it was a great place to live. It was very unique. My grandparents, I should say, one of my set of grandparents never had indoor plumbing.
Whoa.
They had an outhouse cantilevered on the edge of the cliff in the North Atlantic. So when you went to the outhouse and you looked down, it was the North Atlantic 100 feet down. So it was an interesting place to to grow up, and to see how my dad grew up, and then I guess the other thing about medicine was I thought about my dad became a marine biologist, and my uncle became a doctor. And I thought wow, they grew up in this house with a cantilevered outhouse. And I thought wow, my dad made such a jump and my uncle made such a jump. And that was the other thing for me too, is my dad made such a jump. Do you know what I mean? In terms of wealth and prosperity from his own parents who did their best, in a very harsh climate in a tough area. And I thought wow, that was such a jump. And it always stuck with me that my dad made a big jump. And I'm not saying I wanted to make a big jump, but it certainly was something in the back of my mind to make a proportional jump from my own parents. And so I always had this internal stress, if you will, this internal motivation really to make a proportional jump.
When was that awareness of that wanting to make that jump?
Oh, high school, junior high probably. I mean, junior high, I would come home in junior high and I would study 2 or 3 hours a night to succeed. And, I'm no genius. I'm just like, I train fellows in my practice. And the first thing I tell them is like, I'm no genius. I'm just somebody who works hard, and that's really like, if I was to have one character attribute, it's perseverance and just dogged perseverance. And so anyway, that's Newfoundland. And then, my dad took a job in Ottawa, which was very fortuitous for me because there was a lot more opportunity in Ottawa. And so that's how I finished high school in Ottawa.
Wow. I mean, there's so much there we could talk about, but I want to cover at least your story and then we can get back, because there was an important piece there that I'm going to highlight in the future. But, so now you're starting medical school. So it was straight pre-med track for you. You were, again, kind of like,
pre-med. I mean, I did a full biochemistry degree. I actually got into medical school after 3 years so in Canada, they call it undergrad. I don't know. But 3 years of college, 3 years at University of Ottawa, I got into medical school, but I actually stayed for a 4th year to do more molecular biology stuff because I had some unfinished business in that. And I was really deep into it, the renin-angiotensin system and looking at, renin activity in the heart. And I was really into qRT-PCR, which is quantitative reverse transcriptase PCR. And it was like a big part of my life. And so, I got into medical school, but deferred for a year to do some more research. And then, went to University of Toronto for medical school.
Well, let's just dive right in. And so medical school, did it meet your expectations or was there?
No. I mean, the first week of medical school, I mean, I was just hit like a ton of bricks. Like I was like a newfie in Toronto, half the people in my class, the parents were doctors. Like, there's a lot of wealth there. And that was a lot for me to take in too. Like I remember an orientation week, we had people who had summered in Morocco, and it's the first time I had ever heard the word summer used as a verb. And I showed up with Levi's jeans and a cheap shirt, and there's people driving BMWs and $80,000 sports cars. And so that was the first thing. That was a lot to take in. And then I had come from, I loved science. I loved coding. I loved physics and molecular biology. You don't have to memorize anything, which I loved. And then we started at University of Toronto with anatomy, and it was just anatomy every day from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. In the morning, it was lectures. In the afternoon, it was dissection. And so they really wanted you to get anatomy down cold right away. So it was it's called structure and function. And it was just an absolute tirade of memorization. Where's this nerve? Where's this muscle? Where's this bone? How many bones? What are the shapes? Everybody, to me, it was mind numbing. It was just absolutely mind numbingly boring. It was the antithesis of molecular biology and physics and things that I loved about science. To me, it was almost like a bait and switch. Like I went into medicine thinking it was going to be science, and medicine is not science. Mm-hmm. And there's science in it, but it's not science like I had come to know and love science. And so it was very, I came out of a pre-med program where I was the gold medalist. I was the star. I was publishing. I had 4 molecular biology papers before I went to medical school. And I get to medical school and I'm really just average, because I'm not a great memorizer, and I've always known I'm not a great memorizer. And it's the volume of memorization. It's just, every day, just like memorize. And there's no understanding. There's no kind of trying to understand concepts. At least where I went to medical school, it was all just memorize. And that was a real ego blow, when, you go from being the top student and doing things that you're good at to being a mediocre student doing things you're not that good at, and you don't really enjoy. I didn't really enjoy memorizing stuff. So that was a pretty rough transition, I would say, for me going to medical school. Truth be told, a couple of months in, I actually went to University of Toronto Law School, and I talked to the dean of the law school, and I said, I don't know if this is for me. And he told me, he's like, you should just stick it out for the first year, and then, just see. And I mean, I was just grasping. I thought of like doing engineering or going to business school or whatever else. It was a tough, I would say it was a pretty tough year for me.
So would you say that conversation is what kept you there that full year?
Yeah, I would say that was part of it, is to just I had made this decision to do this, and I thought, well, I'm just gonna stick it out and just, make the best of it. At the last half of the first year of medical school, the first semester ended right before Christmas. And luckily the second part of the first semester was cardiovascular sciences. And I was like a master. I mean, I had worked at the Heart Institute for like 6 years by that point. And so, but they failed half the class right before Christmas. Now, I was not in the failing half of the class. But I remember people going home devastated after that, because luckily that part was more concept and, do you understand cardiac physiology? And it was like, drinking from a fire hose for those, I remember 4 to 6 weeks of that course. And so I did go home I went home at Christmas, feeling better about myself. Like, okay, there is a part of medicine where like I belong. It's not just mindless memory of anatomical structures. There is some concepts, and my background is somewhat helpful. So, unlike half my class that went home and had failed that part of the course, I went home feeling pretty good about myself. So that was helpful. And also then, Canada, it's like the dead of winter. Then it was spring. And then I also got the summer after first year, I went back to the Heart Institute where I had a really good scholarship. Like I got a grant to do my research that summer. And so I had like that to look forward to. So yeah, that kind of got me through first year.
Yeah. How was the rest of medical school?
I would say second year was better. Second year, I met my wife, Jen, who Kevin knows well. And so I would say so in Canada, I don't know if it's down here, but Canada, the first 2 years of medical school are all book learning with some clinical, and then third and fourth year is all clerkship, like clinical. And so second year, I wouldn't say I attended all the lectures, or I don't know if I attended 50% of the lectures, but I just learned the game. Like all they want me to do is memorize this stuff. So what I would do is I had parallel tracks. I would read and inquire, like, what do I need to know about anemia? What do I need to know about osteoporosis? What do I need to know about things? And I would ask it in very Socratic ways, like in very basic ways. And then I did my own reading. And in parallel to that, I'd memorize the minutia that I knew they wanted me to regurgitate on the exam. And I knew going to lecture wasn't going to help me with either of those tracks. So I would search out whatever resource, like if we were doing endocrinology, I would read whatever I needed to read on endocrinology, and I'd memorize the notes. But I knew that this time I had figured out going to lecture was just them regurgitating at the time it wasn't PowerPoint, I don't know what it was, but regurgitating the notes that they want you to memorize. But I had the notes I needed to memorize. My time was better spent learning the concepts behind what they were asking us to memorize. Mm-hmm. And so second year for me was a lot of spending time with Jen and doing that, which at times felt odd. Like, I mean, there was like weeks where I hardly went to class, but I was doing well. And it all paid off for me though. In clerkship, really, it paid off. And so I went in clerkship, there was rotations where people who had much better marks than I had weren't so good in the clinic. But I had spent the first year or two, mostly my second year, really focused on what are we talking about? Like when people say anemia, why are you anemic? What is, and yeah, I hadn't memorized as much of the minutia, but I knew the gist. Mm-hmm. And really knowing the gist helped me. And so in clerkship, that's where I really started to shine and do well. Interesting little anecdote here is when I was in second year medical school, Jen and I started a web business called Cyberpage, and it was cyberpage.com. And so Cyberpage was, the idea behind it was, we went to businesses around colleges. So around like University of Toronto, we went to businesses like pizza places and ice cream shops, and we would sell them a package where I and Jen designed their website, and we then marketed it to university students like on the campuses. And so you would get coupons and stuff through it. And so I had like this briefcase, like this nerdy, hard briefcase, and I'd go around to the businesses, and I had these laminated sheets. This was like 1995, wow. 96. And I had like Netscape or whatever, like whatever the browsers were at the time, Alta Vista. And so I would go and I would say, okay, there's this thing called the World Wide Web or the internet. And, it's something that you might want to be on. And half of it was just me educating them about the internet. And then I'd be like, okay, like is there a $100 package? There's a $200 package. Anyway, and so Jen and I ran that, and it actually became profitable. This is what I was doing on my parallel track while I was in medical school. But then at the beginning of third year, Jen had torn her ACL, and I was starting clerkship, and we had a decision to make. Like either you can't. Where I went to medical school, clerkship was, they gave you that pager and then it's on, right? I mean, you can't be dabbling in other things. And so anyway, we stopped Cyberpage, which is now called Facebook, I think. But anyway.
I got a question though for your second year experience, and this, I don't want to derail a little bit, but you talked about learning to learn and Socratic questioning. Those are advanced like learning techniques. Where did you learn those?
Molecular biology.
Oh, did they teach that? I mean, were they teaching you in that style, or did you just pick it up?
I picked it. So there's an interesting, when it goes back to grade 6 for me, I think. Like I think one of the defining points of my life was when I was in grade 6. And so my parents got me a Coco, a color computer. It was a Radio Shack computer. And when you turned on that computer, there was a blinking cursor because it used the programming language. And I wanted to play video games. And that's what I had, was a color computer. I had a few games for it, but I really wanted to learn to program video games. And so I taught myself trigonometry, because as you know, like if you're going to program games, it involves vectors and things like that. And every vector involves trigonometry, right? If you're going to plot out where the dot is, you need to learn trigonometry. So I remember taking my sister trigonometry. My sister's 4 years older than I am. I took her trigonometry books and I taught myself trigonometry. And so from an early age, I guess I always understood, and this is like with my kids now, I have a 6 and a 9-year-old. Like I truly believe that anything you learn, you've taught yourself. Because that's really, for me, like I learned to code myself. Nobody taught me to code. I didn't learn to code in school. I taught myself how to code. Like molecular biology, I'll tell you a story of molecular biology. I was at the Heart Institute, and they thought, you're in high school. what do you know about molecular biology? And so for the first 2 weeks, they had me read safety manuals. And they're just like, put me in the corner with the safety manuals. And so I went up to my supervisor, whose name was Papo Boer, Dutch guy. A bunch of Dutch people worked at the Heart Institute. He was a Dutch molecular biologist. And I said, like, Dr. Boer, like, I don't want to read these manuals. Like, I'm here to do molecular biology. Like, there must be some project that you can get me involved with. And he said, okay, you want to do a project? I'm trying to clone this stretch of DNA, and here's the plasmid that I'm using. Here's the restriction enzymes. This is technical, but I'm just to get to the point. Here's the restriction enzymes you have that you could do it. Go home and figure out how you would get that stretch of DNA into that plasmid using these enzymes in as few steps as possible. So I go home. I have there's like this cookbook, the Cold Spring Harbor, like this cookbook of molecular biology. I go home. I have that. I have a couple of other things that he gave me, and I come back, and in 2 steps, I had figured out how to do it. And that's a big deal because it takes a couple of days because you've got to put the plasmid in and everything. And he's like, whoa, like, that's really good. But it was self-taught. He gave me some tools, and then I taught myself. And so I guess from like an early age, I don't have, I guess I do. I kind of have a little bit of a disdain for formal education. I know that I have to do it, but I know that really when it comes right down to it, you teach yourself. And that's why I have a problem to go ahead a little bit. Like ACG&E right now, they come in and they do inspections for my fellowship. And I remember the first time I talked to an ACG&E inspector, he said, who leads the lectures? And I said, the residents lead the lecture. And he said, that's the wrong answer. 80% of lectures should be led by faculty. And I said, that makes no sense. These are 30-year-old adults. Mm-hmm. It is a travesty that I would lead the lecture. Learning needs to come from within them. And if I'm spoon feeding them, that's like not even learning. And I really got it. I really had it out with this guy. But he's like, well, you have your opinion and the ACG&E has their opinion. And the ACG&E is the opinion that matters. And I just have a fundamental problem with that. I think middle school children, learning comes from within, and to be spoon-fed, it just goes nowhere. I've told you how I learned in second-year medical school, and obviously it works for some people, but it doesn't work for me. For me, it kind of needs to be something that comes from within. And that coding thing for me it's the first time I had ever really learned something to a deep level. And actually, I got jobs teaching coding to like 5th grade kids and stuff. And it was because I taught myself coding. And so it was very powerful for me, that paradigm of teach yourself.
You're killing me because there's so much stuff to talk about. Like, just killing me. I'm writing notes going, oh my God, there's so much to talk about. But we got to keep going because we have a lot of stuff else to cover. All right. So much we want to delve into there, but we're not going to. Now you're in medical school. You have gone into clerkships with learning how to learn and being able to apply concepts and learning kind of the what and whys of things. So when it comes to residency, I'm going to assume that Canada also parallels the US in that way as well, because we do the first 2 years of clinical, the 3rd and 4th years are your clerkships, and then residency match. So how does that approach for you? And then what was your specialty and why did you choose it? Because that obviously relates to now.
So for me, and Jen and I had this like big conversation about this at our dining room table, because I was thinking like, maybe so in Canada, like to be a cardiologist, I would have done internal medicine for 3 to 4 years, and then a cardiology for 3 to 4 years, and then they often do like interventional fellowship or whatever. But in Canada, if you do primary care, you can re-enter training. So in Canada, primary care is 2 years, not 3. So So I knew that. So like if you did 2 years, you could go back and retrain. Whereby if I did internal medicine, that's it. I mean, that's your training and you're done. And also I was still had this, like, I wasn't totally sure about medicine. I just wasn't totally sure it was for me. And so I decided to do family medicine, which is primary care in Canada. And so I matched into primary care in McMaster. And McMaster was just like the perfect place for me. So McMaster University, if you don't know, is basically the birthplace of problem-based learning in medicine. And it started in the early 70s there. Harvard later adopted problem-based learning. Now people know problem-based learning is good even for like elementary children. And McMaster was a very like open-minded, kind of like, why do things work? Very Socratic, very unlike the regimented way of University of Toronto, at least the way it was when I was there. And it was just a great environment for me. So I really enjoyed my primary care years at McMaster. You know, I mean, like Gord Guyot and those guys, they wrote the book on evidence-based medicine, which I also have thoughts on now. But anyway, they really were outside the box thinkers, which really was great for me. Open-minded thinkers, very collegial environment. So I had a really great time in primary care. I knew I was doing primary care to do emergency medicine, by the way. I knew that if I was going to practice medicine, it was going to be ER. Like I loved ER when I was a clerk because there was just so much. You never knew what was coming in. And you were always thinking. It was always on the fly. And that's what I didn't like about cardiology is I remember I loved cardiology research, but cardiology rounds, they would have these like index cards and like which coronary is diseased and what in like, and then it was all this like trials, like, oh, like what did this trial say about that? It wasn't like ER where it's like somebody's coming in. What am I going to do? I got to think from first principles. I have to think. I don't have to just regurgitate the latest, you know, ARB trial or whatever, you know, like so cardiology research cardiology was great. Clinical cardiology probably wasn't going to be for me. And so anyway, I had a great time at McMaster. It was a great place. And so then I did ER. And I had done some derm in residency. And actually the last year of medical school, I did derm and did really well in derm. And I remember thinking like, whoa, like derm is so competitive. I mean, it's like crazy in Canada. They train like, I don't know, like 15 derms a year in Canada. It's like unbelievable. And I remember thinking like, oh, why hadn't I discovered this sooner? You know, because the other thing was I learned is like, I don't really like staying up at night. Yeah, I don't really like being awake all night. And, you know, some people probably do. And maybe nobody likes it. I don't know. But for me, it's like, I don't like staying awake all night. I feel really terrible the next day. And I thought like with derm, it's like, oh, like they don't stay up all night at all, you know? But anyway, so then I practiced ER in Toronto.
So did you, can I interrupt you real quick? So you did the 2 years of primary care at McMaster, and then did you track in and just start doing like practice in emergency medicine?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Now in Canada, you probably do a third year, an EM, but back then, most people didn't. You just went straight into the ER. Yeah. And so that went well for me. I mean, I think I was a good ER doc, like, you know, I worked a lot. I worked 22 nights a month, like 12-hour shifts, single covered ER. There was nights I'd see 100, 120 people.
Wow.
And so I worked ER from 2000 until I went back in 2004, mostly at Toronto hospitals, like Toronto East General, Centenary, like all over GTA. There was a year I worked in London, Ontario, because Jen was going to school there. So I was like full on ER. I mean, I was like doing it every day. And the ERs I worked, like the specialists didn't come in. I mean, I did chest tubes, I reduced Colles fractures, I did all my own lacs, intubated tons of people. I mean, it was full on. It was full on where I was doing it. I mean, I remember I had a friend who was a plastic surgeon. I won't name the hospital, and he was a junior plastic surgeon. And the senior plastic surgeons told him, if you get an ER page, you don't go to the ER, because we have trained the ER that they handle everything. I once had, when I was an ER doc, I have a lot of stories, but I once had a husband who threw some kind of flammable liquid on his wife and then lit her on fire. Huh. And then he got burned in the process. Came in, he dumped her off at the ER, and then he had to come in. I mean, I'll never forget this. And then she came down the hall, and all I heard was somebody moaning, "I'm going to die, I'm going to die." And she was black, just black. All the clothes was burned, skin is falling off, walking in. So we bring her in, we resuscitate her. And this is in the middle of winter in Toronto. And he comes in, he's got inhalation damage. We intubate him. And she's got inhalation damage. And I mean, they're just filling up with fluid. And I'll never forget. I mean, I can see this, right? And so they're in bays 1 and 2 of critical area, and snowing. It's like a snowstorm, right? And so we didn't have a burn unit in our hospital. So I'm resuscitating them. But in the meantime, I got a whole ER. I mean, I got these 2 people. I got a full ER. I mean, I got chest pain and belly pain and lacs and fractures and everything. So I'm managing these people. I'm managing an ER. And so the burn unit's full at Sunnybrook, which is the main Toronto burn unit. So these people are going to have to get shipped out to London, which means a helicopter. And so this is going to take hours for them to get shipped out. And so so we had Critical. So Critical is who you called if you needed people to be transported. So I called Critical, and they said, "Oh, you're going to need your plastic surgeon to manage these people." And I'm like, yeah, that'd be great. Can you call them? And so I call the plastic surgeon. He picks up the phone, and I describe it, and he's like, "Hold on 1 minute. I don't do burns." Click. It was rough. I mean, it was like hand-to-hand combat working, Canadian. When people talk about Canadian healthcare in America, it's it's not as bad as the Republicans say and not as good as the Democrats say. It's it's a little, it's a little in the middle. I mean, and there's no such thing as Canadian healthcare, of course. Every province has its own healthcare system. So healthcare in Ontario is different than healthcare in BC. And furthermore, it depends on the density of doctors. If you're in downtown Toronto, you are getting excellent quality care from world-class people with not much wait time. If you're in rural, Saskatchewan, that's a different deal, So, there's no such thing as Canadian healthcare. And even though I just described an event that was not great, overall, the healthcare is good, especially if you're in downtown Toronto. But it can be pretty limited if you're outside of that. So anyway, I mean, that's a bad example that I just gave you. But I had lots of examples of that where I was the one managing this stuff. And I describe my years of ER, I describe to people as it was an amazing job and a terrible career for me. I learned a lot about humanity. I learned a lot about, they call it the difficult patient, which I hate that term. But I learned a lot about when people are in a bad state, they behave in certain ways. And I learned how to deal with those people. So now, in my practice, oh, you're good at dealing with difficult patients. I'm good at dealing with people. Because people come from a lot of, people have economic hardships and they're in pain, and it's going to make them behave in different ways. Some people can be in pain and agony, and they're like, "Oh, hi, how are you today?" And, "Yes, my leg is broken, but how are you?" But, but not everybody's going to be like that, right? And so ER taught me a lot about dealing with people, getting tough, doing lots of procedures. I got really good at doing procedures. But I knew I didn't want to do it when I was, like I just turned 50. I didn't want to do it when I was 50. It wasn't for me. I know there's a lot of career ER docs out there, but for me, the other thing is I was doing it like 20 nights a month. So I was on a track to burnout because of my schedule, because of the intensity of where I was working, and because of my personality that I didn't want to be up at night. And I also, as a medical student, loved the variety and not knowing what was coming in. As an adult, when it's my license on the line, I increasingly didn't like it. I'd get anxiety. If I knew like, I remember towards the end of my ER career, knowing I was going to do dermatology, I remember there was a house fire where like a woman and her daughter jumped out of the third floor because they didn't want to get burned, and jumped, and they had like fractures and everything. And I remember this coming in and having all this anxiety, like, how are they going to, and I just didn't, it just wasn't for me. Like there's adrenaline junkies that love that, but for me, and especially because in the situations I was in, it wasn't always part of a team. It was often me managing that. It just wasn't the way I wanted to live my life going forward. So I was lucky. I had a reentry track, and so how it works in Canada is first you get the funding. So you had to convince the government to train another dermatologist. That took about a year and a half or so. And then you take that funding, and there was two programs. There's University of Ottawa had a dermatology program, University of Toronto. University of Toronto was like a world-class dermatology program. So I got into Ottawa first, and I kind of was like, well, I'm not so sure, because I was waiting to get into Toronto. And then I got into Toronto, and it was kind of like a no-brainer. I mean, I'm going to go to U of T to do dermatology. Knowing, by the way, that there was Mohs surgery, and because I loved procedures in the ER, I pretty much knew from day one I was going to do Mohs surgery.
So how long is derm after you've done this reentry track?
So normally derm is 2 years of internal medicine or primary care and 3 years of derm. But because I had done the two, it was just 3 years of derm. So it's the same as in America. Except in America, derm is 1 transitional year plus 3 of derm. So anybody who trains for derm in America usually has to do an extra year of internal medicine in Canada to sit for the Royal College exam. And so anyway, so derm is 3 years. So I did 3 years of derm and then applied into the San Francisco match for Mohs and matched into Seattle. And that's how I ended up in the US.
So this is just a little point of kind of interest here. So as a Canadian physician, the San Francisco match, which is this sort of like that specialized match for certain programs, you can transition into that no problem, as there's like no other steps other than just.
Oh yeah. Coming from, it's actually it's a pretty easy process to go from Canada to America. It's not as easy to make the reverse jump. Because Canada often has extra years. Like for me, for derm, it's 5 years to write the Royal College. Most American dermatologists have 4. So like when I was training, there was a guy who had trained in Michigan in derm. He was doing an extra year of internal medicine so he could sit for the Royal College exam. Then I will also talk about the exam. The Royal College exam in dermatology is difficult. It's 1 day of written, not multiple choice, written. I mean, they have like a question at the top of the page, a sentence, and a blank piece of paper. It could be like, draw the porphyria pathway and explain its relevance to PCT. It's written. It's written. So the first day is written. I mean, writing, no multiple choice, no true or false, writing. If you don't know how to spell it, it's wrong, right? So that's day 1. Day 2 is an oral exam. So like you'll be looking at microscope slides, and then like a world expert in dermatopathology walks in the room and says, tell me about the slides, and starts to quiz you on it. And it can go anywhere. I mean, if you bring up methotrexate, they'll say, oh, you brought up methotrexate. What's the mechanism of action of methotrexate? Oh, do you know any case reports around toxicity in this population? And I mean, there's nowhere to run and nowhere to hide. It's brutally difficult.
Wow.
And
how long was the oral part then? Was it
a day?
The full day was oral.
I mean, pretty much. My recollection was it felt like a week, but maybe, I don't know. It was it was definitely more than a few hours. And so Canadians, when we go write the American Board of Dermatology exam, I mean, I'm just going to be honest, it's a joke. I didn't even really study. I wrote the American Board. I had thought I was going back to Canada to practice Mohs. So I didn't have American Board exam, but I was ACGME. So yeah, I did my fellowship. And then when I knew I was going to stay in the States, I wrote the American Board exam that summer. I mean, this sounds obnoxious. I didn't even study really. Because it was like, I mean, I had so much knowledge from training in Canada. The University of Toronto Derm did such an amazing job training me. It was so rigorous, and we had some failures when I was a junior in the Royal College exam, and it really lit a fire under me and my co-chief Devendra to say, hey, we're not going to have staff teachers, we're going to teach ourselves. And so that was another point in my life where it was like, oh my gosh, like I could fail the Royal College exam. I've come back to train and I could fail that exam. I am not failing that exam. There is going to be a 0% chance I fail that exam. And the only way, going back to my trigonometry example, the only way I know I will pass that exam is if I take control of my learning. Mm-hmm. And so, Devendra and I like outlined a curriculum and really took it on ourselves. Like we are going to hammer these concepts, and we are going to leave nothing to chance that we are going to pass that exam.
Man, you definitely, there's so many podcasts, Kevin, we could think of, like the dogged determination, the self-initiative, this love for learning, all these things. So to stay on track, because I can go on a tangent too, with being in derm now. So how long have you been doing derm at this point? Like, what year was it you're officially doing derm?
So I went back to dermatology in 2004. July 2004, I started dermatology.
Okay.
My last ER shift was June 17th, 2004. Not that I remember the day fondly, but I do remember walking out, and I walked down a hill and I could see my car. And I remember them saying like, oh, maybe you'll come back in moonlight. And I said, yeah, maybe. And I walked out, and the sun hit. It was like 7 o'clock in the morning because I had done a night, and the sun hit my face, and it was warm. And I thought, and I breathed in the air, and I thought, I'm never going back again.
That was awesome. So you have such an awareness and good memory of a lot of things that really stuck with you over the years. After you started the derm, I mean, I know you have multiple layers to you. When was this next layer of, or has it just been derm? I mean, I know Kevin knows you a lot better than I do, but
we have to get to the Mohs part, because you're 2007, you must have finished derm.
So 2007, I finished, but like day one, I love procedures. The thing I did love about ER was procedures. Like I loved reducing Colles fractures, which I know would have been more ortho, but I loved all procedures like lacerations and stuff. And so I knew, like pretty much day one, I knew I wanted to do Mohs. So the two Mohs surgeons were Christian Murray and Noel Solish, who I still know well, and are great, really great guys. And if you're listening, hi. But I mean, I pretty much came out to them in the beginning. I was like, like psoriasis and atopic, that's not really my bag. I'd really rather do Mohs. And so they knew that. And so I did a lot of research with them. We published, I don't know how many papers now, but a few. And so they knew I liked it. Everybody knew I was pretty much open about that I wanted to do it, even though I knew there was not a great chance of getting in because there's the match. And so, yeah, I was like a Mohs keener for those 3 years. And so then I matched. The match happens in I think November of my senior year. So November of 2006, I would have matched in to Seattle. And I actually, this could get really deep here, but anyway, I came on a J visa thinking I was going to go back and be the Mohs surgeon in Ottawa. But then a lot of stuff happened in Ottawa, and I won't get into all that, but effectively halfway through, I didn't really have a job in Ottawa. There was a lot of Canadian medicine can be very political, by the way. And so I'm scrambling. but I was on a J visa, so I had to practice somewhere that was under service. So they offered me a job at UW, but I couldn't take it. I mean, King County is not under serviced. And so anyway, I looked at different states. We looked at going to Green Bay, Wisconsin, but there was a practice here in Oregon. My current practice had a practice in Woodburn, and Woodburn, Oregon is under serviced. And so anyway, it turns out that, there's a story behind this as well, but I ended up in Oregon because I needed to go to a place because I came on a visa that would have made me go back to Canada for 2 years. And to get out of that, I needed to go somewhere underserviced. And so anyway, $25,000 of legal bills later, I at the time I lived in Salem, Oregon, and now I live in Corvallis, Oregon. But yeah, so I did my Mohs fellowship in Seattle and then ended up here in Oregon.
Wow. So again, so many things. And I'm already going to set the stage here, Bill, and just say we're going to have you back on another episode.
Okay.
We already have another episode planned. Another one after that, because there, like Melissa said, there's so much to do. But I think this is good for episode number 1. So as we end, and then we're going to prepare for the second stage of Dr. Lear's career path here. Where can they find you now if the listeners are interested in learning, maybe contacting you, hearing about your path, and maybe there's someone who's doing these, there's a physician out there who's doing some of these changes. Where can they find you on the interwebs?
Well, in podcast too, you'll learn about Suture Guard. And so I'm on LinkedIn. LinkedIn is probably the best, way to connect with me. So you could direct message me on LinkedIn. And if people want to email me, they could probably email me best at bill@sutureguard.com. And I'm on Instagram. In full disclosure, I don't totally fully understand how Instagram works. I'm very rare. I don't go a lot on Facebook. I'm mostly on LinkedIn because that's a big platform for Suture Guard.
All right. So folks, stay close. So here for episode 2 coming up, and then Melissa, you want to take us out?
Absolutely. Well, thank you again, Bill, for joining us on the Change Physician podcast. It was a pleasure, and looking forward to the next episode. I am Melissa Katie, the Challenge Doctor, with my co-host, Dr. Kevin Cuccaro. If you don't know what the Change Physician is all about, you can always go to thechangephysician.com, join our community there, learn more about us. Whether you're a physician or a physician ally, we'd love to have you in the community. And of course, check out our podcast episodes, including YouTube and all the typical podcast venues. You can find us on Instagram and Facebook as well. And we look forward to seeing you soon. Take care.
Stay well, folks.